and controls that kept screwing you over. You call it Nintendo hard, I call it primitive. I like how this game, and indeed the series, looks. So with that, I've pretty much described every Mega Man game ever, and I could probably just copy-paste this for every subsequent discussion.
Man, Mega Man sure is different from what I remember.
Super fighting robot, Rockman. Doesn't quite have the same ring to it, does it? Mega Man. Wow, he has had quite the interesting history. If you were to take a single copy of every single game with the Mega Man branding on it, you could probably create a staircase to the moon, and yet the series has never been the most popular in terms of pure numbers. Only a handful of games in the series have ever sold over 1 million copies, which is probably one of the reasons the series had to have a nice sleep for nearly 10 years, and after a long period of laying dormant, it seems that Capcom are finally trying to bring the old Blue Bomber back, but this series' history dates all the way back to the dying breath of 1987 with the rather humble game simply titled Mega Man on NES.
And rest assured, I'm not going to be talking about the terrible cover art because, well, that's been done to death, brought to a local necromancer, revived, then done to death again.
It's strange to think that the game that started a series with sequel after sequel, and spin-off after spin-off, and even sequel to spin-off after sequel to spin-off, was such a humble, understated game. But in spite of that, Mega Man 1 set the mold for 1 million games to come. It was only the second game by former legendary, now infamous game director, or rather glorified character designer Keiji Inafune, and Mega Man himself represented a shift in Capcom from a mostly arcade-based business model to more of a home console focus, so Mega Man as a series started out as a very significant crossroads for Capcom. Not an earthshaker, but definitely a noteworthy shift.
Now, I would go more into the development and significance of Mega Man 1, but hey, it's better than nothing, am I right? With that said, let's take a look at Mega Man on the NES. Yes, I do have an actual copy of this game. It cost me $60. There's a reason why I don't collect games as much as I used to.
So what is Mega Man to those of you who have been living under a rock for the past 30 years? Well, it's a fairly rudimentary 2D platformer where you jump and shoot at things. Kind of a simple setup for what would become one of the most enduring franchises in video game history, but what really sold it from the beginning was the smoothness. Traditionally, games of this era, particularly platformers, were very stiff and janky, where the controls were just as big of an obstacle as the enemies themselves. Even the best games of this era, like Castlevania or Ghosts and Goblins, had very skewed mechanics and controls that kept screwing you over. You call it Nintendo hard, I call it primitive, but the controls here are basically seamlessly responsive. You have a specific maximum jump height, which is predictable, but the reach of your height is also dictated by how long you press the jump button. You will immediately stop the moment you let go of the button, and will also pause in the air for a brief moment and have an accelerating fall, which feels realistic. Best of all, you retain control over all of your movements while in the air, so you can make finer adjustments, or even completely abort a jump halfway through if you're not feeling it. This game doesn't really have the same momentum system as something like Mario, but it benefits as such, so you're not having to make snap over and under compensations causing you to miss platforms and die. Mega Man himself feels very heavy as a result, which makes sense as he's mostly metal, but he controls very smoothly. Your hitbox is also very generous. You can catch a platform with the very edge of your foot and still land it. The compromise is that when you get hit, you get uncontrollably thrown backwards slightly, which will kill you sooner or later, and it also doesn't throw you in the same way you were hit, but counterintuitively the opposite way you were facing, which is confusing. But overall, the platforming is fair, with a responsiveness that makes it stimulating and level design that takes advantage in creative and fun ways. The shooting is basically what it is. What you see is what you get. Your base blaster is your everyday go-to attack that deals with most enemies in a few hits. It's fairly standard gunplay, elevated by the outstanding enemy variety, each with a subtly different approach you have to take in order to deal with them. So the game can always stay moderately fresh in its short runtime. You run the gambit of flying enemies, shooting enemies, bouncing enemies, enemies that have a very short vulnerability window, enemies that move in a wave pattern, etc, 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 and that sometimes corresponds with the level design in interesting ways, like enemies that will shoot at two different elevations when you climb a ladder, or enemies that correspond with platforming challenges, like the invincible enemies that rush you on the same elevation, which can cause some interesting challenges. Of course, gameplay also expands somewhat. If you know anything about Mega Man, it's the groundbreaking mechanic that makes it so when you defeat a boss, you acquire their weapon, which can be used on other enemies and bosses. Each enemy and boss has a specific weakness and several attacks that they're immune to, and there are some useful weapons for various situations. The electric attack is a really good all-rounder that shoots in 3 different directions, but then you have the ultra situational weapons that are only good for progress and a single boss, like Gutsman's throwing arm, because you need blocks to use it.
Saturdays.
Even then, I really only use these special attacks on the bosses that are weak to them, and occasionally very specific instances because they have limited attack power and you have to refill them by getting power-ups or by getting a game over. Otherwise, the goal is to go through each one of these stages and take out each of these enemy robots, then go after Dr. Wily the mad scientist. So with that, I've pretty much described every Mega Man game ever, and I could probably just copy-paste this for every subsequent discussion. At heart, this game is jump and shoot, and that's pretty much it. I think that the basic nature of Mega Man is one of its bigger issues. It had the base down, it had most of the details that would go into define later games, but where later games would emphasize varied mechanics that gave the gameplay and design a chance to spread its wings, the mechanics are basically bare bones here. But in spite of that, I honestly think that this is one of those rare cases where the first game doesn't suffer from first game syndrome, because as I mentioned, the later games were able to sprout out from the base that this game created, but what this game creates with its super simple nature is basically 60% of what each game would end up being, sometimes more, and the additions that would come later would amount to, at best, 40% of the experience. Of course, I'm referring specifically to the classic Mega Man games. The X games, the Legends games, and so on and so forth have major design overhauls. What I'm saying is that the system at a core level was basically as good as it was ever going to get from the very first game, and minus some minor jankiness in design, this game could stand up alongside pretty much any of the other classic Mega Man games from a design standpoint. In terms of robot bosses, you have a fairly basic selection with Iceman, Fireman, Electman, Gutsman, Bombman, and Cutman. Bombman. Unlike most games that follow, we only have 6 Robot Masters instead of the standard 8, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that the Mega Man gameplay formula has a shelf life, and it has a very fine line between too short and too long, and I'd rather a game be short and fun instead of long and arduous. The bosses themselves, however, are a fairly mixed bag. Like, you have Iceman, who just throws 3 projectiles at you at 3 different elevations, so it's just super easy, and then you have people like Cutman, who throws a projectile at you, or Bombman, who also throws a projectile. Most of these bosses are too easy because there's very little going on, unless you get caught, because there's no way to get out of the way quickly, and that wouldn't be a thing for 2 more games. Then you have the opposite problem with someone like Fireman, who throws the equivalent of a tactical nuclear strike at you. I could beat this without the boss weakness, but it would take me a while and a few game overs. Basically, every boss is piss easy if you have the correct weakness. I'm sure this was much more satisfying back when knowing the weaknesses were about trial and error or buying magazines, but it kinda loses something now that you can just look it up. Honestly, most of these robot bosses are at worst inoffensive, and the worst thing I can say about these bosses don't have anything to do with the bosses themselves. For some reason, and to my knowledge this is the only game that does this, before every boss you have to face a big gauntlet before getting to the boss itself. I don't get this. If you step through the boss door, reasonably you'd think that the boss would be right after, but there's a checkpoint, then you have to go through more level before fighting the boss, by which time you may have already taken more damage before the boss. But thankfully none of these bosses are too hard except for maybe Fireman, so it's not a deal breaker. Each level is split into 3 parts. Portion 1, Portion 2, Boss. Usually, but not always, each specific portion of a level will be split by a level design or visual design. What I find is that there will be a specific type of obstacle that each portion builds itself around, then the second part will base itself around something else. The most obvious example of this is a Electman stage, where you have to start out inside a facility, then climb out. Then once you're visually outside, you've reached part 2, where you'll see different hazards like sequences of bottomless pits and double ladder sequences. Then there's some things like Gutsman stage, which starts out with these falling platform hazards, then you get to the area where these platforms are swapped out for the spikes as the primary hazard. It's fairly easy to recognize and predict the design when you realize this. There will be crossover, such as most pairs of portions will use the same enemies. The easiest way to tell is that each portion will have a checkpoint. A few rules of thumb I made while playing these games is that you cannot die in the opening portion of the level, and you cannot make it to the boss with 0 lives. Preferably you should make it to the boss with 2 lives, but 1 life will do. If you make it to the boss area with 0 lives, chances are you've already taken damage and you don't have a second chance, and if you're going in with less than full health, you might as well just cut your losses. Then when you do make it to the boss with more than 0 lives, your first try is just to feel out the boss, get a look at its attacks, patterns, and see how much damage you do. Chances are you're not going to beat it on the first try, but you'll be prepared for the second try, and if you do beat it first try, bonus. Then try number 2 is when you have full health and an idea for the patterns, so you go for the kill using that, and maybe the boss weakness if you have it. Never use the boss's weakness on the first go. You don't want to waste it before you're sure you can beat the boss. Now that's just my strategy. I found the level design to have a predictable pattern and structured my playstyle around it, but there are different ways to play. Maybe you're good enough to be able to bum rush every hazard without stopping. I'll be the first to admit I'm not the best Mega Man player, so you could probably find a better strategy than me. One minor strategy I employed was exploiting the spawn system. If a character exits the screen, they no longer exist, but they also automatically respawn once the screen scrolls past a certain point, so if they move off screen but you're standing where they spawn, they're gone. This was only really useful in one spot where you have to deal with the Mega Man tradition of disappearing blocks, and one of the ground things were giving me grief. These disappearing block things are in many Mega Man games, and they're never not obnoxious. Most of the time you don't know they're gonna appear until they already have, so it's built for trial and error gameplay. Granted, it's only obnoxious when you have to start doing them over instant death bottomless pits. Then it becomes bullshit, because without foresight or a bunch of luck, you'll probably miss or choke a few times. Game overs aren't bad, it's more modern in how game overs will leave you at the beginning of a stage without checkpoints and reset your points to 0.
Because I totally care about that.
Which is fine until it's the level design screwing me over rather than me being thick. Beyond that and Gutsman stage's opening with a hard to navigate collapsing platform challenge, the level design is actually fair, and even then those platforms are all within the first 30 seconds of the level, so you're not wasting your time getting to the hard part. You very rarely feel like there's anything you can't handle. Even the odd instant death spike wall isn't too bad, especially when you unlock the one power that allows you to create a temporary platform. There are level gimmicks. Iceman stage has the cliched mechanic where the level is slippery, so you have to fight against the level. There's a bunch of lava and fire gimmicks that you can freeze in Fireman stage. Nothing too massive. Very characteristically of its time, Mega Man 1 is very surface level, but there's nothing wrong with that. Even in spite of how old the game is, gameplay-wise it still holds up insanely well. There are very few improvements that later games could really make at a base level. The only thing is, they clearly didn't have an idea about how they wanted the series to look in some of the fine details, so things like the menu and the power-ups look like they're from an alternate dimension, but that's pretty much it. And honestly, I like how this game, and indeed the series, looks. I think every game from the NES tried to have a different approach to how they stylized themselves in order to look halfway decent, because the resolution is so low, it's not a case of how do we want to look, it's a case of how can we look with such a narrow color gamut and non-existent resolution. Right from the start, I like the style. Mega Man himself really sticks out. Naturally, he's the most detailed character in the game, and the exaggerated nature of his design has aged quite well, which makes sense because people still use this sprite as a base for many entry-level pixel art. I like how the backgrounds are able to be detailed without descending into artistic vomit. They manage to squeeze coherent shapes and deliberate design using intelligent shading and pixel placement. In particular, I really like how Elecman stage looked. The only thing is, the sky is usually pitifully weak. In almost every stage, the sky and sometimes the general background is just a flat color, which makes the game look a bit bland in parts, but otherwise it looks as good as an NES game can pretty much look, and the music is classic. Mega Man is considered the gold standard of chiptune music, which should be apparent by the countless amounts of remixes that have been made of these pieces. Mega Man 1 is one of the lesser entries in the series in terms of appreciated soundtracks. Most people talk about 2 in that regard, but there are still some great ones like Gutsman stage, Wily 1, and I think my personal favorite, Elecman stage. I like how uncharacteristically among chiptune music, some of these pieces have an operatic quality where a note will waver rather than stay flat, which is something that I think adds a lot of depth to the notes played. See anything sung by Bruce Dickinson to see what I mean, and take note of why he's my favorite singer in the world, other than being a showman to rival Freddie Mercury.
There's no joke here, I just wanted an excuse to use some of the concert footage I recorded. Great night, but I'm pretty sure my niece still hasn't recovered. Ooh.
So seeing as this is an NES game, it doesn't really have a story worth talking about. What's the story? Dr. Wily bad. Take out Dr. Wily as well as all of his robot masters. The only modicum of story you get comes at the very end when Mega Man sheds his armor and there's a freeze frame with him, Roll, and Dr. Light. But whatever this means is interpretive. I'm sure there's probably some stuff written in the manual, but in case you haven't noticed, I don't really have the manual, so that's a moot point. Like, I heard that originally all these robot masters were meant to be used as utility robots, but were reprogrammed or corrupted by Dr. Wily because apparently Dr. Light needs a gardening robot with projectile clippers capable of decapitating the Lincoln Memorial. And we apparently need a robot who can light fires like Postal on crack, but all that matters is what's in the game, and when it comes to Mega Man 1, what you see is what you get. But like I said, that's not a bad thing, because as fun as it would be to make fun of botched translations and whatnot, I'm perfectly fine with something that tries to do one thing and one thing really well. But because all of these classic Mega Man games are so small, I want to have a distinct topic for each one. For Mega Man 1, I wanted to talk about the phrase Nintendo Nintendo hard.
Or as it's referred to as these days, the Dark Souls of blank, because games journalism is the corpse that keeps on twitching.
The idea is, back in the day, console games were based on their arcade counterparts, which were designed to be coin eaters. Combine that with the fact that games didn't have the storage capacity to be very long, and so they had to be very hard to pad themselves out. I'm not 100% sure of this, but I remember hearing years ago that Mega Man 1 was the game that coined the term, or caused the coining of the term, Nintendo hard, and if I'm being honest, that's a load of bullshit. Nintendo hard in my mind is the type of hard that makes you upset, where you actually stop and think to yourself, I'm probably never gonna finish this game. The type of games that are so unforgiving that it takes a non-stop session from 10 PM to 6 AM to beat. Bubble Bobble is more of a Nintendo hard game than this is, if only for the impossibly hard final boss. Mega Man 1 is one of the easiest games on the platform that I've played. The design is predictable, and as long as you're not a buffoon, the actual level design is rarely ever that unfair. You may lose progress every now and again, but as long as you're vigilant, you'll rarely take significant damage. The only times that this game becomes quantifiably unfair is in the Yellow Devil boss fight and Gutsman stage, because that's where they really get buck nutty with instant death bottomless pits where you have to hop from platform to platform, and even then, once you get the timing down, you'll be fine. I think the hallmarks of Nintendo hard games are overwhelming amount of enemies, poor skewed level design, stiff awkward controls, and a poor attack power to enemy amount ratio. Basically, the hallmarks of being Nintendo hard is just being badly or primitively designed. Mega Man 1 has competent level design, smooth fluid controls, and an enemy selection that rarely ever feels unfair or overwhelming to deal with, so it shows that once you put the ball back into the player's court, it's not actually hard for them to start scoring. Tortured metaphors aside, this is one of the first NES games I beat, and it was long enough ago that I didn't even know that LCD TVs weren't optimized for NES games. I ended up beating this game with a quarter or possibly a third of a second delay. It was arduous and much easier the second time on a proper display, but I did it. The only part of this game that I've had to resort to exploits would be the aforementioned Yellow Devil. Look at this pattern. If you haven't memorized the exact way he comes apart, yeah, you're pretty screwed because he can drain your health in a second, and because this entire side of the arena is where he ends up, your safe zone isn't nearly big enough that you have enough time to dodge his bits with 100% accuracy, so it's just trial and painstaking error, and I don't find that type of design particularly engaging, because what does it mean? Repetition and lots of it. Game overs, remember, send you back to the beginning of the stage. There's an exploit where if you pause and unpause, you'll reset the game cycle, allowing you to damage him with an attack multiple times. Maybe an unfair advantage, but I find this boss unfairly difficult, so I don't mind taking advantage of exploits as long as they're in-game. If I were plugging in a Game Genie, that'd be different because that's external to the game. For the record, I'm also okay with looking up the boss order because there's clearly a deliberately designed way to go. Doing otherwise would just be needlessly going out of my way to make the game harder for myself. I know some Mega Man fans are weird about that. Fact is, I play games by their rules, not the rules of some hardcore jackass who vehemently only plays Mega Man X1 Buster only and scoffs at doing it any other way.
Whose name also happens to be Kyler for some reason.
If it's in the game, it's fair game. So that brings me to the final stretch of Mega Man. The final sequence is actually fairly straightforward. You go straight into Dr. Wily's fortress and beat him without anything really happening or changing on the way to mix things up. You fight your way through the hardest levels in the game, but nothing too unmanageable. You fight your own clone, but you can cheese the fight by standing in the corner and shooting at him with your standard shot because he'll just jump and so his shots will usually miss you, but then he usually comes right down into your shot. Then you fight the aforementioned Yellow Devil, or rather, Rock Monster. The less said about him, the better. Deal with some gimmicks like rushing water, forcing you down a current, then the boss called the Bubble Machine, which is slightly obnoxious, but it's not as obnoxious as what comes next. The first in a long tradition of boss rushes. Let me tell you a secret, alright? I've never liked boss rushes. They've always seemed like lazily recycling content as opposed to any meaningful challenge because there's no challenge. We've already beaten all these bosses and so there's no skill in beating them again. It's just that now it's a battle of attrition on top of everything else. So these shouldn't even be called boss rushes. That sounds too exciting. They should be called recycling attrition rushes. It's just padding for the sake of padding, and this series never gets past this. Literally from game 1 onward, it just becomes accepted and expected for Mega Man games to have a boss rush, and since day 1, nobody's ever thought to themselves, wait, do we really need these? In the early days, they were acceptable because recycling means a longer game without having to waste cartridge space, but after 30 years, they've gotten tiresome, but that's more of a general complaint. I think this boss rush is not only the first one, but it's also one of the worst in the series because you're not even given a chance to do them in the order you want. There's a predetermined order. Usually I like to do the hard bosses first so I have the most resources to put towards them, and then I breeze through the rest en route to the final boss, but no such luck here. On the bright side, however, there's nothing hidden about this game. My usual issue with Mega Man games going forward is that too many of them have a bunch of hidden content that only serves to pad the game out, but Mega Man 1 mercifully doesn't hide anything. What you see is what you get. as I've already said twice. Also making this the shortest game in the series. I beat it in around 2 hours, and as I mentioned, I'm not even a great Mega Man player, so immediately following this is the 2-part final boss. The first part is a joke. If you use the fire attack, which has a barrier with several damage frames, you can literally beat this part in around 3 or 4 seconds, and the second part is slightly tough, if only for the fact that Wily's attack has a massive attack radius, but it's not too hard once you get a few good shots in, and if you really can't be asked, you can also use the pausing exploit on this boss as well as every other boss, but in this case, I'm above that. So you beat Wily and Mega Man runs home in victory.
And that was Mega Man 1. Oh, got it the first time.
Mega Man 1 is basically the quintessential middle-of-the-road Mega Man experience. It does some things really well and other things not so much. It's right smack dab in the middle, and for this series I'm gonna introduce a ranking system, kinda like a tier list, but I'm gonna try and make it my own somewhat. Mega Man 1 is middle of the road, so it gets a C rank. Not amazing, not terrible, completely middle of the road experience in terms of what Mega Man is. If you play this game expecting a Mega Man game, it will be the exact thing you expect in every way, including quality. No more, no less. This will from now on establish the baseline of quality for Mega Man, and if you can outdo Mega Man 1, you're above average. If you fall short, you're below average.
Alright, well that was fun, but now I gotta go to work.
This video was brought to you in part by my lovely patrons. I thank you for your continued support. If you want to become a patron for TGX, the link is in the description.